Okay. So, Nick, yesterday I put up a very short introductory video talk on addictions. I just made two main points. One was that I reject the medical model and don't consider alcoholism or any addiction to be an illness. Um, and the second point was that I thought that addiction is simply a set of techniques to ward off or numb uh, mental pain. And that from a psychoanalytic point of view, the therapy involves trying to bring that mental pain to consciousness, explore its origins, usually in childhood, but not always, um, and work that through. And then at a certain point of the working through, decision becomes possible. That is, the person has to consciously decide that they're done and take on the work of rejecting the usual defensive maneuver, which is the addiction. So I left it at that. That's a very simple approach to a complex problem. We've had a couple of people respond, uh, suggesting that it's much more complex. One person indicating a very psychosocial approach, all kinds of complexities. So I just wonder what your take on all of this is.
Yeah, so I mean, I would in general agree with the comment that it's more complex. I mean, I see addiction as involving defense as well. But one can't generalize. I think that different substances are more or less addictive for different characters. So, the person who's prone to misuse of stimulants will be much different than the person who's prone to use of opiates or dependence on opiates, where the sedatives and depressants are much more about seeking soothing. And the stimulants much more of a manic defense about empowerment and strength and blasting through anxieties.
But still a defense.
Still a defense, but I think we have to take the analysis of the defense a little further
Oh, sure.
into thinking about character and development.
Mm-hmm.
So, what it makes me think of is what were the deficits in the early environment? Either the patient didn't get enough soothing or enough stimulation from their caregivers. I think you froze there for a second.
I think it was a phone call coming in that disturbed us.
Oh, I see.
Carry on.
Did you hear what I was saying? That in a sense that identifying the use of the substance as a defense can contribute to character analysis. And
Yes, because different characters are defending against different issues.
different primitive anxieties,
Right.
um, abandonment versus overstimulation. I think what we can say though is that people who are very prone to addiction had chaotic early environments in one way or another.
So, but that's a generalization. Do you think, though, that there might not be people who had relatively, what would Winnicott say, good enough early environments who might get into an addiction because at some point in their 30s or 40s, They may be in a very overstressed situation, major stress at work, major stress at home, and they might turn to a substance in that moment of stress, and that substance just happens to work for them. Do you think it's always necessarily rooted in early childhood?
I think for the addiction to be observed as a true characterological tendency, there has to be something in childhood. I mean, your example, I sort of think, yeah, that person might turn to the substance as a defense, but it would be more flexible if it was that contextual to their work in their 30s and so on. I don't think it would be as likely to constitute a real addiction crisis for the person. And they might, be able to exchange the substance for a broader repertoire of defenses more easily.
Easier to cure in that way.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, there's also narcissistic vulnerabilities, for a lot of people, they regard their substance habits as their edge, the thing that makes them function, the thing that makes them competitive.
Right.
And that's a bit of a double bind because if you depend on a drug to feel powerful, then, at some point you have to recognize you're not doing it for yourself. And that's a blow to the ego as well.
Right. But again, I have to say that if you're depending on a drug to feel powerful, what that means is that the drug helps you ward off feelings of weakness, vulnerability, impotence, etc. So you're still defending against mental pain.
Yeah, but different kinds of mental pain.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I like Grossman's way of talking about mental pain. He talks about unwelcome affect.
Okay.
And I think in a way that when substance use becomes problematic, in many ways, it's contributing to psychic retreat. It's an avoidance of the anxieties of both the paranoid schizoid and the depressive position.
Mm-hmm. I guess by definition, it's a psychic retreat, isn't it?
And it can be idealized as a transitional phenomena, a transitional space, but it's oftentimes when it becomes destructive, it's much more of a psychic retreat.
Against both paranoid schizoid and depressive states.
Yeah.
Yeah. Against both types of guilt, persecutory and reparative.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, what do you think about the role of conscious decision and I don't know, ongoing intentional struggle against the substance?
Right. I mean, I do think willpower is important in the recovery process, but I think we should try to recognize a continuum from free choice towards loss of agency in the addictive process. This goes, I think, to some of the questions you received about the medical model, whether addiction is a disease. Some progressives feel that calling addiction a disease is emancipatory, because it removes the idea of moral failing.
Right. I made a first attempt at that video and I erased it, and then I made a second attempt. In the first attempt, I got into that issue and I forgot to bring it back um, in the video that I put up. I think there's a real paradox here. I think there's no doubt that telling, say, an alcoholic that he shouldn't feel guilty because he has a disease and we are not responsible for our diseases. This can be very helpful because it lowers his level of guilt. And oftentimes, guilt drives him to drink. So if you lower the level of guilt, you're lowering the pressure to numb the guilt by drinking. So it's a very useful thing to say, but it's a lie. I think we forget that lies are often useful. That's why we lie, because lies are useful. This is a therapeutically useful lie. You're
But
telling him it's an illness.
it's also a vague lie.
Still a lie.
Well, what I mean is, I think there needs to be a little more specificity in how we intervene to address that superego problem and arrest the vicious cycle of guilt drinking, for example.
Right.
Because, probably when the person first started drinking, they had more choice than they do now when, they're seeking treatment for the problem. And this gets back to the disease issue because, of course, there is some substances, unlike other substances, most stimulants, for example, being really only psychologically addictive. You think you, whereas opiates, benzodiazepines, alcohol, past a certain threshold of dependence, there is a physical syndrome. You can die from withdrawal. You can have
Right.
seizures. And that's, I think, where the disease model becomes a little more applicable, right? And of course, all kinds of diseases are created by our decisions in life about what to eat and how to live. So I think it's already a contradiction. It's a preposterous assumption that disease in general doesn't involve an element of choice in the beginning.
Mhm. Well, I hear what you're saying. I would say that the drinking or the benzodiazepine dependence or whatever, I don't think it's a disease. What you seem to be saying is that the dependence on those substances can lead to disease. But that's obvious. But that's not a
Disease
that's
which
not
reinforces dependence.
yes, a disease. Okay, but it didn't start out as a disease.
No,
The
it started
disease
out as defense, and that's what I'm saying. I think there's a trajectory from defense to disease that's what
okay.
we're talking about.
Okay, I hear you. I hear you. But we're agreeing that at the beginning it's a defense against mental pain, but
Yeah.
it's a defense that may cause physical complications, at which point it becomes a disease. But my point is that the people who push the idea of alcoholism as a disease are not making your point. They're saying that the drinking or whatever is in itself a disease, whereas you're saying it can lead to a disease. That's a different point.
Well, yeah, I know. I mean, to be specific, I'm saying it's a false dichotomy from the very beginning.
How so?
Um, to have this polarized split kind of binary view, either or decision or disease.
Um, See, my point in saying it's not a disease is not because I want to say it's a decision.
No, but that's the discussion that's been being had, right?
That's not the discussion I want to have.
Well,
That's a misinterpretation of my view.
well, I'm
They
not just
think that,
addressing you, I'm addressing some of your viewers who have raised
okay,
questions, right? And this is
okay,
broadly the cultural conversation that's being had. So I think we have to be very careful. I know
okay.
that you use the word defense in a subtler way, you know, recognizing that, you know, it's not quite decision because it's the unconscious part of the ego that's employing the defenses. And I get,
Right.
um, and in a way, isn't analytically our whole idea of pathology, at least in ego psychology, is that it's a complex, it's the result of a complex of defenses that are no longer useful or have been maladaptive.
But the psychoanalytic point of view is more than that, though. I mean, um, I'm thinking of Roy Schaefer. Um, you know, Freud takes a very deterministic point of view. Freud thinks that free will is entirely an illusion. He classes the belief in free will with religious illusion, and he adopts a pretty hard determinist position. Okay, I remember the passage where he says, "Our increasing scientific knowledge is a decentering. It's a blow to our narcissism. First, Copernicus reveals that we're not at the center of the universe, but out in the burbs." And then Darwin comes along and says we're descended from apes, and then Freud himself comes along and says we are not even masters in our own house. So he takes that determinist position. Roy Schaefer brilliantly says that psychoanalysis reveals that we are far more masters in our own house than we can bear to recognize, that we unconsciously contrive to ruin our lives. We unconsciously contrive to repeat, endlessly repeat painful patterns. If we're masochists, we unconsciously contrive to find a partner who is sadistic. Okay, much of our work is revealing people's unconscious choices.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I still have trouble with the use of the word choice when speaking of unconscious process. I tend to think more in terms of mechanism or maneuver, but
Well, choice seems to fit, man. I mean, if you're a masochistic man and you're a subby and you go to a party and there are 20 women there and 19 of them are sweet, kind-hearted people, and there's one dom, you're going home with the dom. You're scanning the party unconsciously.
well, you know, but there's that too. We're getting a little off topic, but that too is more complicated, right? Because as Deleuze says, true masochists very rarely meet true sadists. The most sadistic thing you can do to a true masochist is say, "No, I don't feel like punishing you."
That's still sadistic, isn't it, to the
Yeah,
masochist?
yeah, but how often does that happen? You know, the masochistic contract, it really is more about cajoling the person into doing what
Yeah,
they want.
yeah.
So there's omnipotence there. Um,
Mhm.
but getting back to the issue of addiction, I mean, I do agree with somebody in your comments who really, I think, alluded to the idea of overdetermination. And
Yeah,
that might be considered one of the things that the biopsychosocial model pays a bit more respect to. But the problem that I have with the biopsychosocial model is right in the name of it, it still gives primacy to biology.
right, right.
But as
What?
I said, there you
The idea that
deny
some
that
people
there's
have
a
a certain
biological component.
some kind of genetic factor that makes you vulnerable to a particular drug.
Well,
Uh,
actually, I think we have to be very careful there not to engage in a kind of eugenic discourse, right? I mean, CAMH was conducting research trying to use genetics to explain why there are so many methadone overdoses in the prison system in Canada. It really only takes a social psychologist a few moments to think about the rat park experiment, right? And this is just with rats, but it was powerful findings that, those classic behaviorist experiments, if you put a rat in a cage with a lever that administers them cocaine or heroin, they'll press that lever repeatedly until they die.
yeah.
Now, if you put a rat in a cage that has those same levers, but also has other rats and wheels to
So
run on,
he has community.
you know, they'll dabble with the cocaine and heroin and they'll actually get bored of it and go off and do social things.
Uh-huh, right.
And so for people to say there's a genetic vulnerability that causes methadone overdose, and that explains the rate, of people who
Mhm.
die of that in prison because
Ignores the fact that they're in cells and they don't get any exercise. And yeah,
and they're being punished unfairly for a nonviolent drug offense.
right,
So you take in people who already have addictions, confine them in an unpleasant place.
right.
Um, and so I think that's a risk in the kind of biologistic thinking systemically or politically that it can let other factors, really, such as oppression, off.
Sure.
It can occlude them and leave them out of the conversation.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's also a critique then of the illness model.
I think it is, right? It's highly individualizing.
Right,
And,
right.
a lot of the medical consequences of addiction are not necessarily specifically tied to the chemical, although that's has its role, but there's social determinants of health. That campaign, they were really denigrating amphetamine users and their teeth. There was a campaign called Meth Mouth, and it kind of created this attitude that it was really inhaling the chemical that eroded the teeth. Well, it
Hmm.
turns out it's just a drug of choice in situations of poverty because it's available, it's cheap.
Hmm.
People who are in the highest throes of addiction don't tend to remember to take the greatest care of, themselves.
Hmm.
Um, and so I just think these discourses contribute to a lot of misconceptions about the harm of
Right,
addictions.
right, right.
And often that's mobilized against racial minorities and the poor.
Yes, right. Um, Back to the illness model. I mean, I suspect that um, people hearing me reject the illness model, I think their minds automatically jump to the conclusion that I'm pushing free will and responsibility and failing to understand the work of Thomas Szasz, who actually, wrote back in the 1950s, and you don't hear much about him anymore. But his argument has never been refuted. My reason for rejecting illness is not to push the idea of free will, free choice, and responsibility. My rejection of illness is simply Szasz's. There is no illness is a term that applies to physical medicine. Something is an illness if it has a physical, a biological, a biochemical, a neurochemical cause. And many of those things that we call mental illness have not been able to be shown, proven that they have any kind of a biological cause. Once a biological cause is proven to exist, then it's not a mental illness anymore. It's now a physical illness. So the category mental illness remains for behaviors that some people want to call illness, but that cannot be proven to be an illness.
Yeah.
Illness being defined biologically. That was my point, not to push a discourse of free will and responsibility, not because I want to scold alcoholics for drinking too much. I think that point has been rather missed.
Yeah. Saz actually has a book about drugs called Ceremonial Chemistry. And he says that to call substances that kill pain and confer pleasure, quotes, addictive, is as ludicrous as calling gasoline flammable because it's easy to ignite.
Uh-huh.
So obvious.
Uh-huh. Right.
But I do think that addiction is a little different than mental health broadly in that I hesitate to call it illness as well, and I recognize your reasons, but there are grave somatic consequences, factors,
Consequences.
well,
Okay.
also factors in the process of addiction.
What do you mean in the process?
Well, the research on dopamine and reward, for example, the anhedonia that one experiences in withdrawal. There's a biochemical substratum to all of that is actually more empirically proven than, for example, the serotonin depression link theory.
Yeah, but people who are not involved with substances at all still sometimes fall into anhedonia.
Oh,
And
sure.
people who are not involved with substances at all sometimes get a high from going to the gym or jogging, whatever.
I think that's biochemical too. Endorphins.
Yeah, yeah. But
Success.
that's right, right. So some of these things can be caused chemically, but some of these same states can be had without any chemical, without any extra chemical, external chemical involvement, right?
Yeah, but then I think I'm trying to point to the fact there's still endogenous chemical action.
Right. Okay. I still don't see how that.
Well, I find your stance, it's a little bit well, it's a defensive about psychoanalytic ways of thinking, which exclude uh, this kind of bodily substrate of experience.
I'm not following the logic of
It's
this
it's
argument.
reductive. I think that the reason people are raising the biopsychosocial model is it recognizes it's trying not to give primacy only to the mind, and it's recognizing the interaction between the environment, the mind, and the body. And I think that that's kind of needed, especially when it comes to addictions.
You know what? What I think? I think the people who emphasize the biopsychosocial blah 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 sounding so reasonable and talking about overdetermination, you know what? They're never going to get around to the psychoanalytic perspective. They won't get around to it. In broad statements, they'll say biopsychosocial. They won't get around to the psychoanalytic, probably because they don't have any training in it. One of the commentators spoke as if as if the field has entirely turned away from psychoanalytic understanding of addiction, which is far from true. In the Canadian Journal, I know we published two articles. What was his name? Dodds, I believe, and someone else. Well-trained psychiatrists who were also psychoanalysts. And they were basically saying that psychoanalysis is the treatment of choice for addiction. And they were reviewing evidence in the field. So it's really false to say that that the psychoanalytic approach to addictions has somehow been invalidated and is now passe in favor of biopsychosocial.
I'm
I don't
actually
buy it.
saying that it's the same, but you see, you find it very threatening. And I just think, this kind of undialectical thinking, it's not useful. I think actually what I'm trying to say is that the biopsychosocial model has ripped off a lot of metapsychology
Uh-huh.
from Freud.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Will they acknowledge it?
I mean, maybe some, but it's not becoming of us to be so worried about that and so defensive, I think.
I don't know whether it's defensive. I think it's assertive of a point. Listen, in my own practice, very limited, anecdotal, doesn't constitute scientific evidence, but I've had a number of alcoholics who I'm not going to say I have cured, who got cured through their work with me. Now, for 20 years before coming to me, they were exposed to people with a biopsychosocial orientation. They went to sophisticated treatment centers all around the world where they were assessed and treated by psychiatry, by psychology, by social work, by group therapy. And it got them nowhere.
Yeah.
Uh, okay, they
Again,
got somewhere.
I mean, I don't think we're really having any more irrational discussion about how addiction should be understood. We're valorizing different camps. And I actually think that I think we know that theoretical model does not always imply treatment approach. I think that there's a lot of analysts that would do better with addiction because of the frame of the analysis, the many times a week, and the free association, that would still be able to incorporate a lot from the biopsychosocial model just in terms of how they conceptualize addiction. Not
Yeah,
necessarily how they work with it. They might do classic defense analysis on it very productively, but in how it's seen and understood as a social reality.
yeah, okay, obviously, but what is actually helping the patient? What actually is the engine of the cure? That is sitting with someone who helps you understand the pain that you are avoiding through the addiction
Yeah. Yeah.
and who is non judgmental about this, who is not saying pull yourself up by your bootstraps, who's not wagging a finger at you, implicitly who understands the pain brought about by the social conditions under which you were raised, the family that you were in, all of that, of course, is taken into account. But the key factor in the cure is helping the patient understand that he is running from pain
Of
and
course.
that he's, yeah, okay, well, that's my central point.
Or towards pleasure.
Well, yeah, from pain towards pleasure. I think that people don't run excessively towards pleasure unless at the same time they're running from pain, frankly.
Probably so. Probably so. But yeah, I mean, I think there's also a lot of addictions where people are, at least consciously, the manifest part is they think they're seeking fun.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I had wanted to also talk about this emphasis in the 12-step world on rock bottom,
Hitting bottom.
hitting bottom. There is a truth in the fact that sometimes the willpower to quit just comes from the fact that spontaneously the substance becomes profoundly unfun. And there's interesting individual differences. Going back to my earlier point, one person can try methamphetamine, which has this reputation for being instantly addictive, one dose. And,
Mhm.
and that's profoundly wrong, because somebody can try it and think, God, that made me so paranoid, I never want to go near it again.
Mhm.
And yet for another person who has a different experience of mental suffering, it's can be the thing that makes them function. And in a way, that's where its addictive potential lies.
Mhm.
Um, and so what's happening in that rock bottom experience? Like, are things getting so bad that somebody is overcoming their masochism, their addiction to near death? Um, because that can happen naturally outside of any treatment process.
Right.
People do just decide they've had enough.
And they're rational enough to look at the effect that it's having on their life.
Yeah.
Mhm. Right. Any other point that you wanted to address before we close?
Um, yeah, I mean, lots. I mean, we could do a comparative discussion about how it might be seen in different analytic orientations.
Oh, yeah.
I think in self-psychology, it might be thought of as a reaction to
Narcissistic injury.
missing, well, I was going to say ego weakness, which would include that, like missing, lost, or damaged bits of structure in the self, so that one wants to seize something from outside
Right.
to complete oneself.
Yeah. In Kohut's own language, it would turning the addiction would be seen as turning to what he called a disintegration product. The person's sense of self has disintegrated or fragmented, which is a very painful mental state,
Yeah.
brought about by some kind of narcissistic injury, slight, failure, disappointment, whatever, rejection. So they have fragmented, and now they are turning to something like a substance, or it could be turning to driven sex, or it could be turning to intense anger, or to a substance in an attempt to reintegrate the fragmented self. That would be the way Kohut would look at it. And
Mhm.
that is the way they look at addiction. They've done some good work on addiction, um, but the problem with that, I remember working with an addict, and I was working for a long time from a self psychology perspective. Whenever he acted out, I would trace it back to some narcissistic injury, some disappointment. Um, and only after a number of years of doing that, which wasn't leading to much change at all, I began to realize how he was understanding this. Our tracing it back to a trigger of a disappointment was understood by him as a justification. I acted out because because my acting out was justified by the pain that I endured. And this could have gone on forever.
I think that's consistent with my point about psychic retreat, right? I mean, patients in psychic retreat believe there's no use, they don't recognize that to grow, you have to face pain. They think,
Right.
there's a belief that that's impossible, it's the worst, it can't be done,
Well,
which
what the
justification of,
turn in self psychology entirely fits what you're saying, because Kohut continued to believe in the importance in growth of optimal frustration. But
yeah.
many of his followers abandoned that and they turned to the idea of optimal responsiveness.
Yeah, I think in a way Steiner's incorporated that into the thinking around psychic retreats, that but he frames it more in terms of anxiety.
Mhm.
Growth comes from facing like anxiety, getting out of one's comfort zone.
Well, that's purely following Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard, in his brilliant work in the mid 19th century on anxiety, says you, in the face of anxiety, you must face the anxiety and go ahead and do it. Move through the anxiety. Go ahead and do the thing that you're terrified of doing, but go ahead and do it. Otherwise, you become what he called a shut-in personality. And basically, what he meant by that is that if you step back and become shut in, you then become neurotic. All of the neurotic symptoms come because you have failed to move through the anxiety. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think it's a very interesting, and I think addictions can play a role in it. There's a very interesting moment of impasse in so many analyses where the patient may really vehemently insist that they just need to always feel safe.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and to the extent that analysis involves the risk of saying what you mean and experiencing transferences, it halts the forward movement of the analysis, this insistence on never tolerating feeling at risk.
Yeah, needing to feel safe. I'm just thinking of the modern university. I'm thinking of the liberal arts and humanities programs where there are all of these students insisting that in class they don't feel safe. And somehow it's the institution and the professor's responsibility to keep them feeling safe. They feel in danger of being exposed to a point of view that might cause them to feel anxious or guilty. How are you going to have an education in that kind of a context? It's
Oh,
ridiculous.
or an analysis, right?
Or an analysis.
And
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think what I mean, though, is in a way, as a particular kind of defense against free association, often what we see in the patient's substance use is maybe an escalation of their use or an inappropriate timing of their use, really in an effort to deaden the analysis and remain in that cozy, rather false place.
yes.
Uh,
Yeah, a good analysis is involves stirring the pot.
yeah,
This is why Freud used to advise patients to make no major decisions during at least the earlier part of their analysis. Don't get married, don't get divorced, don't buy a house, don't change your job, because the analysis is going to stir you all up. The analysis is going to make you worse before you get better. And
yeah,
so, it's not a time to be making major decisions. I can see that patients coming into analysis feeling pretty okay at the beginning, especially people who come into analysis because they want to train as analysts, and they're not driven to analysis by mental pain. But they
uh,
soon start having mental pain because the analysis starts showing not that the analyst is out to do this, but what starts emerging is their dark side.
yeah, absolutely. Of
Yeah.
course, that the same is true in the addiction recovery world generally. When after you've gone through withdrawal, that's when all of your mental pain emerges. There's usually a crisis after detox. It's an emotional crisis
Yeah.
because the old defense is not there.
The old friend is not there.
Yeah. I wanted to say something to the Lacanian perspective on addiction that
Okay.
matches it with perversion in that its enjoyment is about transgression of the law. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's true to some extent in some cases, that part of the pleasure in substance use, well, it's clouded by the sense of naughtiness, right?
Hmm.
And there's a relation to the superego in that. Um, but I think it doesn't completely work, right? For example, for more socially sanctioned addictions, such as that to alcohol or tobacco, there's no
Hmm.
great prohibition on these, and yet they confer great pleasure and great damage and risk, and they have all the addictive qualities, but they're not opposed by the law.
No, not by the formal law, but drinking excessively and using drugs excessively still is against social opinion, regards it as wrong. You are being looked down on by society. And in a sense, you're being looked down on by the man. It's not actually the cop or the legal system, but it's still a social
Yeah,
superego.
and to some extent internal, like also looked down on by yourself, because I
Exactly.
think that's what we mean by something that's beyond the pleasure principle.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Like it becomes ego dystonic because it takes sensation to such an intensity that it begins to include pain.
Yeah. I think it's very humiliating for a person to realize that they're not freely choosing how to live. Um, they start seeing themselves as slaves, not to a person, but to a substance. And that's humiliating.
Well, that's what I was saying earlier about the narcissistic use.
Right.
You know, if you become dependent on a substance to enhance yourself, you disempower your your grandiosity.
Yeah. Yeah. Thinking the way alcohol works, I mean, the effect of the alcohol can enhance your grandiosity. It's disinhibiting, and you can get grandiose until you, at some point, look at yourself as a mere slave of this chemical, which has undermined your freedom to choose how you want to live your life.
Well, on a
Uh,
more micro scale, you'll probably have anxiety the next morning when you can't quite remember what you said and did when you were
right,
feeling so grand.
right, right, right. Okay, well, look, I guess there's a lot more that could be said, but maybe we need to hold it here.
Sure,
Okay, thanks.
no problem.